San Antonio, Texas. Summer, 1878. The man kicked the cast iron skillet clean out of her hand. It hit the wagon wheel and dropped in the dirt. She bent down, picked it up, brushed it off, then looked him dead in the eye. "Kitchen's full," he said. "I didn't ask you," she said. 15 cowboys went silent, then one voice quiet. No warning cut straight through the noise. "Rutledge, that's enough." The trail boss turned to the girl. 19 years old, patched bag on her shoulder, cast iron skillet in her hand. Nothing else to her name. She looked right back at him. "Give me one day. $1. If the men leave a single bite on their plates tonight, I'll walk back to Texas on my own 2 feet." This is the story of Mabel Sterling, the woman the whole West counted out, and the one man who looked close enough to see exactly who she was. Watch now, and stay for the ending you won't see coming. The San Antonio staging yard smelled like manure, sweat, and something close to desperation. Mabel Sterling stepped off the buckboard and planted both feet in the dust like she meant it. The canvas bag hanging from her shoulder was patched in 3 places. The cast iron skillet dangling from her free hand was heavier than most men's opinions of her, and she'd carried both a long way. The yard was chaos. 3,000 longhorns bawled and shoved against the holding pens. Cowboys hollered at each other across the noise. Saddles creaked. Horses stamped. The whole place throbbed with the particular energy of men who were about to do something hard and dangerous and knew it. Mabel walked toward the gathering of hands near the chuck wagon. She didn't get 10 steps before the whistling started. It was low at first. Then someone said something she didn't quite catch, and a group of 4 cowboys near the water barrel laughed hard enough to double over. She kept her eyes straight ahead. She'd heard worse. She'd heard worse from her own family. At 19 years old, Mabel Sterling had buried a husband she'd never chosen, survived a town that had turned her misery into their entertainment, and walked 31 miles over 2 days to reach this yard. A handful of cowboys with nothing better to do than mock a woman's figure were not going to be the thing that broke her. She found the chuck wagon and set her canvas bag down beside the rear wheel. That's when Lyle Rutledge appeared. He was a broad man, thick through the shoulders, with a face that had the permanent expression of someone who'd just smelled something bad. He looked her up and down with slow, deliberate contempt, and then his boot shot out and connected with the skillet, still hanging from her hand. It clanged against the wagon wheel and dropped into the dirt. "Kitchen's full," he said. Mabel looked at the skillet. Then she looked at him. She bent down, picked it up, and brushed the dust off the iron with her sleeve. "I didn't ask you," she said. Rutledge stepped forward. He was working up to something. She could see it in the way he planted his feet, trying to make himself bigger than he already was. The cowboys nearby went quiet, the way men go quiet when they're deciding whether to watch or walk away. "Move along, sweetheart. This isn't a church social, Rutledge." The voice came from behind her. It was quiet. That was the strange thing about it. The whole yard was noise, and this one voice cut straight through all of it without raising itself at all. Garrison Prescott walked up from her left. He was tall, though not in a showy way. His shirt was plain and dusty, his hat well worn. He had the kind of face that had been outdoors too long, all hard angles and squinting eyes. He looked at Lyle Rutledge with an expression that didn't bother with anger, which somehow made it worse. "That's enough," Gar said. "One sentence. Done." Rutledge held his ground for 2 seconds longer than he should have, then moved off with a tight jaw and a lot of noise in his boot heels. Gar turned and looked at Mabel. His eyes went to the skillet, then to her face. "You hear about the cook position?" he asked. "Yes, sir." He studied her for a moment, not the way Rutledge had. It was more like he was looking for something specific and wasn't sure yet if he'd found it. Around them, several cowboys had drifted closer. Grover, a stocky man with a red beard and the permanent posture of someone looking for a fight, crossed his arms and shook his head. "Boss, come on," he said. We're driving 3,000 head 500 miles in July heat. We need someone who can keep up, not slow us down. A few others muttered agreement. Gar didn't look at them. He kept his eyes on Mabel. She was aware of what they saw. She'd been aware of it her whole life. The extra weight she'd carried since childhood, the product of a condition nobody had ever bothered to name or treat. The body that small-minded people had spent years turning into a verdict. She'd watched that verdict follow her like a shadow, from her uncle's house to the old man's door, from the church steps to the gossip circles that called her the virgin widow of ill omen. She was done letting other people hand down sentences about her. She looked at Gare Prescott directly, eye to eye. "Give me a one-day trial for $1, she said. "If the men leave a single bite on their plates tonight, I'll walk back to Texas on my own 2 feet." Silence. Grover made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Someone behind him whispered something she ignored. Gar said nothing for a long moment. He looked at her like he was doing arithmetic in his head, weighing things she couldn't see. Then something shifted in his face. Not warmth exactly, more like recognition. $1, he said, one day. He put out his hand. She shook it. The grip was firm, so was hers. Grover threw his hands up and walked away. Several of the other cowboys exchanged glances. Lyle Rutledge stood at the far edge of the group, watching with eyes that had gone very flat and very still. Mabel picked up her canvas bag and walked around to inspect the chuck wagon. It was a solid Studebaker wagon, at least, though whoever had stocked it last had done a careless job. Flour sacks stored against the damp sidewall. Salt pork wrapped too loose. Coffee beans in a container that hadn't been sealed right and had likely let moisture in. She opened every drawer and cubby in the possum belly and the front boot, cataloged what she had and what was missing, and started a list in her head. She had a lot to work with, if she worked smart. Behind her, she could hear the cowboys talking about her like she wasn't there. The usual things, her size, the rumors. Someone mentioned the virgin widow story and got a laugh. She let it go past her like wind. She'd learned early that people's cruelty said a great deal about the size of their imagination and almost nothing about her worth. That lesson had come the hard way. It had cost her years she couldn't get back. She had it now, and she wasn't giving it up. She pulled out her mother's cast-iron skillet and set it on the tailgate. The iron was dark and smooth from years of seasoning. Her mother had built that layer up over a lifetime of cooking, and Mabel had added to it in the years since her mother passed. There were dents in the handle, from a night she didn't like to remember. But the cooking surface was perfect. It always was. She ran her thumb along the edge of it. Tomorrow, at 3:30 in the morning, before a single cowboy cracked his eyes open, she would have that fire going. She would make biscuits that came out golden and lard-crusted, the kind that broke apart in your hands and didn't require apology. She would make chili bean stew with enough heat to wake the dead and enough depth to make a man close his eyes while he ate. She would brew coffee that tasted like it meant something, and not one of them would leave a bite on their plate. She wasn't trying to prove something to the cowboys. Let them think what they wanted. She was proving something to herself. The same thing she'd been proving 1 hard mile at a time, since the moment she'd walked out of that town with nothing but a skillet and a direction, that she was still here, that she was capable, that no amount of dismissal or mockery or cruelty could take the skill from her hands or the will from her chest. Gar Prescott passed behind the wagon at dusk. He paused for a moment, watching her sort, and arranged the stores with efficient, quiet focus. He didn't say anything. She didn't look up, but she heard him stop, and she heard the moment he moved on, and something in the quality of that pause told her. The trail boss was already reconsidering his arithmetic. $1 for one day. She was going to make it worth a great deal more than that. The prairie at 3:30 in the morning was a different world entirely. No heat yet, no dust. Just cold, dark air that carried the smell of damp grass and sleeping cattle, and a sky so full of stars it almost looked crowded. Mabel pulled her shawl tighter and got to work. She'd scouted the firewood situation the night before and stacked what she needed close to the wagon. She built the fire low and steady, the way her mother had taught her, not for show, but for cooking. A tall fire looked impressive and burned your food. A good cook knew the difference. The coffee went on first, always the coffee. She'd found the beans already moisture damaged, just as she'd suspected. Not ruined, but close. She roasted them again in the dry skillet, watching them carefully, pulling them off the heat at the exact right moment. Ground them by hand. Packed the pot full and let it brew slow over the side of the fire where the heat was even. Then the biscuits. She worked the lard into the flour with her fingers, quick and light, the way you had to. Overwork biscuit dough, and it goes tough. You had to treat it like it was still alive, coax it rather than force it. She added, just enough buttermilk to bring it together. Patted it out on the floured board she'd clamped to the tailgate, and cut them with the tin ring she kept in her kit. Cast iron Dutch oven, hot lid, glowing coals on top and bottom. That was the secret. Most cooks just threw things over open flame and called it done. Mabel cooked like she was in a kitchen, because that was what 15 hungry men deserved, while the biscuits baked. She started the stew. Salt pork cut small and rendered down first for the fat. Then the onion, dried but still flavorful if you gave it time. Pinto beans that had been soaking since midnight. Chili powder, black pepper, a pinch of dried sage she'd brought herself because she didn't trust anyone else's spice supply. She built the flavor in layers, tasting as she went, adjusting. The smell moved through the camp like something with intention. Cowboys started stirring at 4:15, which was earlier than expected. She heard them before she saw them. The sound of blankets being thrown back, boots being pulled on, men groaning and muttering to each other in the way men do when they're cold and tired and not quite awake. Grover was first to the fire. He came around the side of the wagon with his hat already on, and his expression set at its default, which was somewhere between suspicious and irritated. He looked at the Dutch oven. He looked at the coffee pot. He looked at Mabel, who did not look back at him because she was busy ladling stew. He picked up a tin cup and poured his own coffee, without asking. She heard him take the first sip. He didn't say anything, but he took another one. The men lined up in the pre-dawn dark, holding their plates out. Mabel served each one without ceremony. 2 biscuits, a ladle of stew, coffee to fill whatever cup they'd brought. She kept the portions honest and the line moving. A trail cook who made men wait too long, for food learned fast that hungry cowboys had short tempers. She watched from the corner of her eye as they ate. Grover bit into his first biscuit and stopped chewing for a second. Just stopped. Then he started again, slower this time, like he was paying attention to it. He sopped the second one through the stew and finished the whole plate before most of the others had taken 3 bites. He came back for seconds, without a word. Barnaby, the quiet older hand who'd tipped his hat to her when she arrived, ate with deliberate appreciation, the kind that showed in his posture. He nodded once when he caught her eye. That was all. It was enough. Young Eli, the 14-year-old horse wrangler with the dirt-smudged face and the overlarge boots, ate so fast she worried he might choke. He looked up at her over his plate with wide eyes. "Miss Mabel," he said, "this is the best thing I've ever eaten." "You say that now," she told him. "Come back in 3 weeks and we'll see." He grinned and went back to eating. She watched all 15 plates. She watched every last one of them. Not a single man left food behind. Not a scrap. Not a spoonful of stew. Not a biscuit crumb. A few of them even ran their fingers around the inside of the tin to get what was left. When the last man walked away from the fire, Mabel stood alone by the chuck wagon and let herself breathe. $1 earned. She picked up a dirty plate and started washing. By sunrise, the drive was moving. 3,000 longhorns flowed north like a slow brown river, raising a column of dust that could be seen from 10 miles off. The land opened up around them into wide rolling grassland, pale gold in the early light, stretching out to a horizon that seemed to have no end. Mabel drove the chuck wagon at the back of the column, ahead of the drag riders, behind the main herd. The dust reached her anyway. It reached everyone. She'd tied a bandana around her nose and mouth and squinted against it. The chuck wagon lurched and swayed over the uneven ground. She'd packed everything tight before moving, but she could still hear the rattle of tin cups and the shift of the flour sacks inside. She kept one hand on the brake and the other on the reins and watched the trail ahead for ruts and stones. It was hard work, honest work. She'd take it over the alternative any day. From the head of the column where the lead steers walked, with their particular slow arrogance, a rider broke away and moved back along the edge of the herd. Gar Prescott rode like a man who'd been on horseback since before he could walk, easy in the saddle, not stiff, not showy, just present. He pulled up alongside the chuck wagon and matched his horse's pace to hers. He looked at the trail ahead for a moment before he spoke. Grover asked for seconds, he said. I noticed. Grover has never asked for seconds in 3 years of drives. She kept her eyes on the trail. Then maybe his previous cooks weren't trying hard enough. Gar was quiet for a moment. She could feel him looking at her from under the brim of his hat. Not intrusively, just taking stock. Where'd you learn to cook like that? He asked. My mother, then years of practice and not much else to do. She paused. Cooking was the one place nobody could tell me I was doing it wrong. The food either tasted right or it didn't. Didn't matter what I looked like. She hadn't meant to say that last part. It came out before she'd properly decided to say it. Gar didn't respond to it the way she expected. He didn't offer a reassurance or change the subject quickly to cover the awkwardness. He just considered it honestly. That's true of most skills, he said. The work doesn't care about anything, except whether you can do it. She glanced at him then. Just briefly, there was nothing soft or flattering in what he'd said. It was a practical statement, but it landed with more weight than flattery would have. It was the kind of thing a person said when they actually believed it. She looked back at the trail. We're moving well, she said. Is the pace sustainable? For now, the grass is good here. We'll slow at the river crossings. He glanced toward the horizon. Weather might give us trouble by week's end. Wind's been wrong all morning. She filed that information away. Weather meant early fire starts, men coming in colder, and more miserable than usual. A need for something heartier in the pot. She started adjusting her mental inventory. Gar watched her for another moment, then turned his horse and rode back toward the head of the column. The day wore on. The sun climbed and the heat built, and the dust never quit. The cattle were loud and stubborn through 2 shallow creek crossings and a stretch of rocky ground that made the wagon groan. She nursed the horses carefully on the rocks, slowing way down, letting them find their footing. She was not going to break an axle on day 1. At noon, she pulled ahead of the herd and had lunch ready before the first rider arrived. Cold cornbread from the morning, dried beef, and fresh water from the creek they'd just crossed, strained through clean cloth. Simple food. Quick food. Men ate standing up, horses were rested, and the drive was moving again in 40 minutes. She was back in the wagon by the time most of them finished eating. Late afternoon, when the light went orange and long, Gar rode up and down the column, calling the halt for camp. The cattle settled into their bed ground with surprising compliance. The cowboys began their evening rotation, some riding Nighthawk to keep the herd calm, others tending horses, others dropping off their gear. Mabel already had the fire going. She'd chosen the campsite's wind direction instinctively, setting up so the smoke blew away from the sleeping areas. She'd found level ground for the wagon, chalked the wheels. The routine was building itself in her muscle memory already, each task falling into the next. Supper was red beans, slow-cooked since the afternoon halt, sourdough bread she'd started that morning, and dried apple cobbler she'd built in the Dutch oven during the last hour of driving. The cobbler was a risk. She didn't know if she'd have time to manage it, but she'd managed it. When she pulled the lid off and the smell hit the air, a cowboy named Dewey actually stopped walking mid-step and turned toward her like he'd heard his name called. She served them all again. Every plate cleaned, every cup emptied. Eli sat near the fire after eating, watching her clean up with a look of quiet reverence on his young face. "Miss Mabel," he said, "are you going to cook like this every night?" "I'm going to try," she said. He nodded seriously, like that settled something important. Then he went to check on his horses. She stood by the fire long after the camp quieted down, working through the planning for the next day in her head. What needed soaking overnight? What needed restocking at the next settlement, where the gaps in the provisions were? Somewhere above the herd, under the enormous Kansas-reaching sky, the stars were out again. She looked up at them for a moment. Just a moment. Then she went back to work. Across the camp, Gar sat on his bedroll with his back against a wagon wheel, reviewing the trail map by firelight. He had looked up twice in the past hour. Both times his gaze had gone, without him quite deciding it, to the light of the cook's fire and the steady, unhurried figure moving in front of it. He'd hired a lot of people in his life. He'd learned pretty quickly that you could tell a great deal about a person by watching them work when they thought no one was paying attention. Mabel Sterling worked like the work mattered to her, not to impress anyone, not to prove anything, because it mattered. He folded his map and put it away. He'd made the right call. He was certain of it now. What he was less certain of was what that meant for anything else. He pulled his hat down and went to sleep. The rain came on the 8th day, not gradually, not as a warning. It came the way trouble usually comes on the plains, fast and without apology. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in under an hour, and by midnight, the camp was soaked through and miserable, the fire beaten down to a wet, sulking thing that kept trying to go out entirely. Mabel had felt it coming before the first drop fell. Her joints had told her the way they always did when weather was building. She'd spent the last hour of daylight covering everything that needed. Covering, double-tying the canvas on the wagon, moving the flour to the highest, driest shelf. By midnight, she was shivering inside her bedroll under the wagon. She'd felt feverish since mid-afternoon. It moved through her in waves, heat and cold alternating, her head thick with it. She pressed the back of her wrist to her forehead, the way her mother had always done for her, and felt the warmth there. Not good. At 3 o'clock, she got up anyway. She sat for a moment on the ground, waiting for the dizziness to pass. It passed. Slow, but it passed. She tied her wet boots, pulled her shawl double around her shoulders, and crawled out from under the wagon into the rain. The fire was almost out. Just orange coals under a black crust. She rebuilt it from the dry wood she'd had the foresight to stack inside the wagon, moving slow, coaxing the coals back to life with steady breath and careful feeding. Her hands were clumsy with cold. She kept at it. The fire caught. She put the coffee on. She started the biscuits. Her hands weren't steady, and she knew it. She went slower, compensating. The dough went together fine. She got the Dutch oven set up, arranged the coals, put the lid on. Then she stood at the fire and let the heat work on her shivering for a few minutes while the biscuits baked. She was aware, in a distant way, that she was not well. She was also aware that 15 men would be awake in an hour needing hot food, and that no one else was going to make it. Both things were true at the same time, and only one of them was actionable. She stirred the oatmeal. "You're sick." She didn't startle. She'd heard the footsteps coming, slow and deliberate, through the mud, and had assumed it was one of the Nighthawk riders coming in. She turned and found Gare Prescott, standing at the edge of the firelight in his oilcloth rain slicker, his hat dark and dripping. "I'm managing," she said. He came closer and looked at her face in the firelight. She let him look. She wasn't going to pretend. She felt fine when she clearly didn't, but she also wasn't stepping away from the fire. "You have a fever," he said. "I've had worse. That's not—" He stopped. He reached back and unbuttoned his sheepskin coat, the one he wore under the slicker. He stepped around the fire and settled it over her shoulders before she quite realized what was happening. She stiffened. She felt the warmth of it immediately. The interior was lined with wool and still carried the heat of his body. It was enormously heavy and hung past her hips. She reached up automatically to pull it off. "I don't need—" "Leave it," he said. "Not harsh, just firm." She left it. He pulled a crate over near the fire and sat down on it and watched her work in silence for a while. She kept moving, checked the biscuits, adjusted the oatmeal, started the second coffee pot, because one was never enough. The coat was so warm she could feel herself starting to stop shaking. She hated how good that felt. She was too accustomed to managing without. "How long have you been running a fever?" he asked. "Since yesterday afternoon." "Why didn't you say anything?" She looked at him across the fire. "Because I'm still standing, and the work still needs doing. That's the only thing that matters." He looked back at her steadily. "Your health matters, Mr. Prescott. If I told you I was sick every time I powered through something, I'd have told you that before I was 8 years old." She paused. "There are things about how I grew up that made certain conditions go unattended. My body doesn't always work the way it should. That's not new information to me." She turned back to the fire. Behind her, she heard him shift on the crate. The rain came down steady on the canvas overhead. "What conditions?" he asked. "Metabolic. Something with how I process food. Never got a proper name for it, because we never had a proper doctor." She kept her voice flat, clinical. "It's why I carry the weight I do. It isn't for lack of effort. I worked harder than anyone in my family and ate less than most of them. Didn't matter. The body does what the body does." She hadn't told anyone that. She had spent years letting people assume whatever they wanted to assume, because the truth required trust, and trust had cost her before. She didn't entirely know why she'd said it now. Maybe it was the fever loosening things. Maybe it was the coat on her shoulders. Maybe it was 3:30 in the morning, and she was too tired to hold everything in its usual place. Gar was quiet for a moment. "The men who laughed at you in the yard," he said. "They didn't know that. They wouldn't have cared. Maybe not." He paused. "I'm just saying it matters. The difference between a man being ignorant and being cruel is usually whether they were willing to look past what they assumed." She turned that over in her head. The biscuits were done. She pulled the lid off, and the steam came up into the cold, wet air. She transferred them to the cloth-lined tin and put the next batch in. "You were married," Gar said. It wasn't a question. He'd clearly heard the talk. "I was contracted to a man," she said carefully, "by my uncle when I was 18, for land debt." She kept her back to him. He was 60. I had never spoken to him before the ceremony. I had no say in it. The fire popped. "He died the same night," she said, before anything started again. The town found that hilarious, or suspicious, depending on who you asked. "The virgin widow of ill omen, that was what they called me," she said. "It matter of fact, the way you named a scar to a doctor." I left 3 months later. Couldn't afford to stay. She turned around. Gar was watching her with an expression she didn't immediately have a name for. It wasn't pity. She would have closed down instantly if it had been pity. It was more careful than that, more considered. "So you've been treated as property," he said, slowly, and then as a curse, and then as a joke. "In that order, yes." He stood up. He crossed to the fire and stood on the other side of it and looked at her directly. She made herself hold the look. He reached across and took her hand in both of his. Her hands were rough from the work, dusted faintly, with flour, red from the cold. His were rougher, wider, scarred across the knuckles. "There are no widows or virgins on this trail, Mabel," he said. "Only working souls. You keep 15 men fed and alive out here. You've earned the right to look the world square in the eye." She felt something shift somewhere behind her sternum, something that had been locked down for a long time, behind years of careful armor. She didn't cry. She was not going to cry at her own fire at 3:30 in the morning. But she held on to his hands for a moment before she let go, and she didn't pretend that the steadiness of his grip hadn't meant something. She turned back to the oatmeal. "The crew will be up in 40 minutes, she said. "I know. He didn't move right away. Eat something yourself this morning, before they get up." "That's not a suggestion. You're giving orders about breakfast to your cook. I'm giving orders about breakfast to my employee, who is currently running a fever in the rain." She almost smiled. "Fine." She ladled a small bowl of oatmeal and ate it standing at the fire. He stayed until the first cowboy started stirring, then put his slicker back on and walked out into the dark. She watched him go. He hadn't said anything kind to make her feel better. He hadn't minimized it or redirected. He'd heard the actual truth and responded to the actual truth. In her experience, that was a rarer thing than most people realized. She served breakfast. Every plate, every cup, every second helping. Eli ate beside her fire again that morning. He'd taken to doing that, positioning himself close enough to feel the warmth and far enough not to be in her way. She'd started setting aside a slightly larger portion for him, without making a point of it. After he finished eating, he helped her gather the dirty plates without being asked. She noticed that, too. By mid-morning, the rain had stopped, but the cold hung on, and the mud was remarkable. The cattle were sluggish and irritable. The cowboys were louder than usual in their complaints, which meant they were tired. Tired men needed something to look forward to. She planned a better-than-usual supper. In the afternoon, they crossed a shallow creek that had gone over its banks. The water was brown and fast and came up to the wagon's axle. She stood on the seat and kept the horses straight and didn't let herself think about what happened if she lost control of the crossing. She came out the other side with wet boots and a soaked hem and everything in the wagon dry and intact. When they made camp that evening, Grover came to collect the empty water barrel, which was part of his rotation. He set it down beside the wagon and looked at her for a second. "Heard you were sick this morning," he said. "I'm fine." He scratched the back of his neck. Biscuits were good today. It was the closest thing to an apology she was likely to get from Grover. She accepted it in the spirit it was offered. "Thank you, Grover," she said. He picked up the barrel and walked away. That evening, while she cooked supper, she dressed a small burn on Gar's forearm. He'd caught a brand ember during the evening check and hadn't said anything about it until she'd noticed it herself and pointed at it without a word. He sat on the supply box and held his arm out, and she cleaned it with water and wrapped it clean cloth, working efficiently. It wasn't a bad burn. He hadn't flinched once. Her hands moved around his wrist to secure the bandage, and her fingers brushed the edge of his shirt collar, and she felt the beginning of a scar there, old and deep, curving up toward his collarbone. Her hands stilled. She hadn't meant to touch it. She had not been paying attention the way she should have been, and her fingertips had found it before her mind caught up. She looked up. He was looking at her. Not with alarm, not with the practiced distance he kept up during the day. Something closer and more honest than that. The firelight was between them, and the camp was loud with evening noise, and she was close enough that she could see a small muscle working in his jaw. She finished securing the bandage, smoothly, professionally, like nothing had happened. "That should hold," she said. "Thank you," he said. She picked up the cloth and supplies and turned back to the fire, and she made sure her breathing was even before she spoke again. "Supper in 20 minutes, she said. "I'll let the men know," he said. He stood and walked away, and she stood at her fire and paid very deliberate attention to the pot in front of her and did not look after him. The stars came out again that night. Big and clear, after all the rain, the sky washed clean. She lay under the wagon in her dry bedroll, fever finally broken, and looked up at the circle of sky, visible between the wheel and the ground, and thought about a man who had taken her rough, flour-covered hand at 3:30 in the morning and told her she'd earned the right to look the world square in the eye. She thought about that for a while. Then she set her internal alarm for 3:30 and went to sleep. They hit the canyon on day 14. Red Rock Canyon wasn't on the main Chisholm Trace, But the summer had been dry enough that the usual river route was choked with competing herds and short on grass. Gar had scouted it the season before and decided the canyon route would save them 4 days. The walls were sandstone, rust-colored and steep, narrowing the passage to maybe 60 feet at the tightest point. The cattle didn't love it. They moved through in a long, uneasy column, lowing and pressing against each other, their hooves clattering on the stone. Mabel drove the chuck wagon through last, after the drag riders. She'd been watching the canyon floor since they entered. The walls blocked the wind, which was good, but they also trapped moisture from an upstream source she hadn't identified yet. The ground looked solid. It wasn't. She found out exactly how not solid it was when the left front wheel dropped. Not a gradual sink, a sudden lurching drop into a mud pocket that the dry surface had been hiding, the kind of mud that forms in shadow when runoff comes down through canyon cracks and pools under a baked crust. The wheel went into the hub in about 2 seconds, and the wagon tilted hard to the left, and the horses scrambled and strained against it and got nowhere. Mabel set the brake, wrapped the reins, and climbed down into the mud. She went into the knee immediately. She pulled her boot out with a sucking sound and assessed the situation. The axle was jammed against the lip of the mud pocket. The right side wheels were still on solid ground, which was the one piece of luck in this. The wagon wasn't going to flip, but it wasn't going anywhere either. And if the mud pocket expanded under the weight, the situation could get worse quickly. The drag riders saw it and pulled up. Grover came around at a trot and took one look and started cursing. "We're stuck," he announced. "I can see that," Mabel said. "We need to get the hands up here. Get a team of horses on it and pull. That'll tear the axle," she said. She was already looking at the canyon walls, at the debris pile near the base of the north wall. Timber in there. She could see it. Branches, and a hold-down tree trunk that the winter floods had pushed against the rock. "What I need is an oak log. Something solid, 8 to 10 feet long, and as thick as a man's thigh." Grover stared at her. "To lever the wheel out," she said, since he clearly needed the diagram. "We put the log under the axle housing, use the canyon wall as a fulcrum point, get the angle right, and lift while the horses pull sideways. It's not hard, it's geometry." "It's a stuck wagon," Grover said. "You can't outthink mud. I'm not going to outthink it. I'm going to move it." She pointed at the timber pile. "Log. Please." Grover muttered something uncomplimentary under his breath and rode toward the debris pile. By now, several other hands had come back to see about the delay. Word traveled up the column. In 10 minutes, she had 8 cowboys around her, in various states of helpfulness, and then Gar arrived. He came in at a canter, pulled up, read the situation in about 4 seconds, and looked at Mabel. "You have a plan," he said. It wasn't a question. "Log lever against the wall, horses pull at an angle to the left, we clear the wheel out of the pocket and walk it onto solid ground. I need 2 men on the log and 2 on the horses. The rest stay back. Too many people in the mud will make it worse." He nodded once. "Do it." Grover came dragging a section of oak trunk, dense and heavy, still intact from whatever tree it had come off. 2 other hands grabbed it with him and brought it over. Mabel directed them in positioning it under the axle housing, finding the precise angle she needed, using a protruding canyon rock as the pivot point. She talked them through it, step by step. Not loudly, not frantically, just clearly and in order, like she was describing a recipe. Do this, then this, wait for this, then pull. When everything was set, she called it. The men on the log pushed down. The horses pulled left. The wheel groaned and shifted, and for a moment it seemed like nothing was happening. And then the mud released its grip with a deep, wet sound, and the wheel came up and out, and the wagon lurched sideways onto solid ground. A couple of the cowboys actually cheered. Mabel checked the axle. No damage. She checked the wheel. Intact, she exhaled. Then Lyle Rutledge walked over. He'd been hanging back during the whole operation, watching from 20 feet away with his arms crossed, and an expression that Mabel had learned over the past 2 weeks meant he was storing something up. He came forward now with a sack in his hand, the remaining salt, pork salt, 20 pounds of it, precious in the heat, for preserving meat and keeping the cattle from going salt-deprived on the trail. She saw what he was going to do about half a second before he did it. His boot caught the base of the sack and sent it spinning off his arm and into the mud pocket. It hit the surface and went under, just like that. 20 pounds of salt gone. The cowboys went silent. Rutledge looked at Mabel with empty, flat eyes. "Clumsy," he said, and then he smiled. Not a real smile. Then again, some folks are just naturally clumsy, tend to make things worse everywhere they go. "Must be something about the weight they're carrying." He said the last part, slowly, deliberately, making sure everyone heard it. Nobody moved. Mabel looked at him. She kept her face completely still. She had learned young and the hard way that reacting to a man like Rutledge was exactly what he wanted. He was looking for a response he could use. She wasn't going to give him one. What she hadn't calculated for was Gar. She heard Gar's boots hit the ground behind her. 2 quick strides. And then there was the flat, definitive sound of a fist connecting with a jaw, and Lyle Rutledge went down in the mud like a cut rope. It was a single punch. Gar didn't follow it up. He just stood over Rutledge for a moment, breathing through his nose, and then he turned away from him entirely and faced the rest of the crew. His revolver was in his hand. She hadn't even seen him draw it. He didn't aim it at anyone. He just held it, loose and visible, and looked at his men. "Mabel is the heart keeping this drive alive," he said. His voice was flat and clear, the way it got when he wasn't interested in argument. "Anyone who insults her insults their own manhood and has no place in the Prescott outfit." Nobody said a word. Rutledge sat up in the mud, touching his jaw. He looked at Gar. Something moved across his face, fast and ugly, and then it was gone, replaced by that blank expression he wore like a mask. Gar holstered the revolver and walked back to his horse. Mabel watched all of it. She noted Rutledge's expression in the moment before he smoothed it away. She noted the specific quality of it, not humiliated, not chastened, calculating. The look of a man who was adding something to a ledger in his head. She filed it away. She helped direct the cleanup of the mud situation, got the wagon back on safe ground, and walked the horses herself for a quarter mile to make sure they were moving evenly after the stress of the extraction. They were fine. Good horses. When the drive was moving again through the canyon, she sat on the wagon seat and watched the red walls scroll past on either side and thought about Rutledge. She'd been watching him since day 2. Small things, individually dismissible. The way a supply sack got restacked and ended up in a worse position than she'd left it. A water container that she'd filled and sealed and found slightly open the next morning. Coffee beans that had tasted faintly off in a way she couldn't quite put her finger on, and that she'd tossed and remade from a different supply. Alone, any one of those things was nothing. Carelessness. Coincidence. Together, they were starting to form a shape she didn't like. She hadn't said anything yet because she didn't have enough. You did not accuse a man like Rutledge with a feeling and an anecdote. You needed evidence. She kept her eyes open and kept her mouth shut and kept watching. That evening, she made camp at the canyon's northern exit, where the walls opened back out into grassland. The mood was good despite the delay. The wagon extraction had apparently impressed people in ways she hadn't expected. Dewey called her a natural engineer, which made Eli laugh. Even Grover was quieter than usual, in a way that felt like thoughtfulness. After supper, Gar came to the fire. He sat on the same supply crate he'd used in the rain 11 days ago. He accepted the coffee she poured without comment. She sat on the wagon steps across from him and drank her own. For a while, neither of them said anything. The night was warm and dry, a big improvement over the rain. The cattle moved softly on the bedground. "Thank you," she said finally, "for what you did today. Rutledge deserved worse." "Maybe. But you didn't have to say what you said." In front of everyone, Gar looked into his coffee cup. "I meant it. That's the only reason I said it." He paused. "You pulled that wagon out of the mud with geometry and a dead tree. Meanwhile, Rutledge's contribution was losing 20 pounds of salt and making a fool of himself. She looked at him. About the salt. I want to replace it at the next settlement. I'll take it out of my pay. You will not. It's my supply chain, my responsibility. Rutledge kicked it in the mud. His responsibility. She let it go. She wasn't going to win that one tonight. I want to keep an eye on him, she said carefully. Rutledge, just keep an eye, looked at her. Why? Small things, she said. Nothing I can point to directly yet. I just want to watch. He held her gaze for a moment. She had the impression he was deciding how much to trust her instincts. All right, he said. Tell me when you have something. She nodded. He finished his coffee and stood up. He handed the cup back to her and paused for a second, standing in the firelight. You did good work today, he said. It was simply said, no flourish. She suspected that was how he gave all his compliments. Thank you, she said. So did you. He went to check the Nighthawk rotation. She cleaned up the cups and banked the fire and ran through her morning plan and tried very hard not to think about how the firelight had caught the angle of his jaw when he'd looked at her just now. She had work to do. That was the thing to focus on. She went to sleep. The night of the Red River Valley camp started quiet, almost suspiciously quiet. Mabel noticed it while she was cleaning up after supper. The cattle were settled and calm on the bed ground. The Nighthawk riders making their slow circles, the hands talking low around their bedrolls. The sky was clear, the air was warm and still. Too still, maybe. The horses had been restless all afternoon, and horses paid attention to things people missed. She mentioned it to Barnaby, who was walking past with a bridle. Animals are jumpy, he agreed without breaking stride. Might be a storm building far off. Hard to say. She stayed up later than usual. She couldn't put a reason to it, just a flat, persistent unease she couldn't shake. She sat by the banked cook fire, with her mending in her lap, and the camp quiet around her, and watched the darkness at the edge of the firelight, and listened. Eli turned in early. He was sleeping in his bedroll near the remuda, close to the horses as always. She could see the shape of him, in the dark, small and still. She was thinking about turning in herself when she heard it. A single gunshot, sharp and close. Then the world came apart. 3,000 longhorns did not stampede gradually. There was no escalation, no warning progression. One moment they were settled, and the next they were a single roaring mass of muscle and horn moving in a blind collective panic, and the sound of them was something beyond sound, something you felt in your chest and your teeth and the soles of your feet. The ground shook, the air filled with dust and noise, and the hot smell of frightened cattle. The camp exploded. Men shouting, horses screaming, the Nighthawk riders screaming their own calls, trying to turn the herd, boots hitting the ground as the sleeping hands scrambled out of bedrolls. Mabel stood up. She could see the herd's direction. They were running north-northeast, which meant they were running toward the back of the camp, toward the remuda, toward where the corral poles were set up near the canyon wall overhang, toward Eli. She was already moving before she finished the thought. She ran. She ran harder than she'd run in years, faster than anyone would have expected her to run, across the dark, uneven ground, with the thunder of the herd building behind her, and the dust starting to rise and close around her like a curtain. She could hear the corral poles splintering. She could hear the horses screaming as they broke free. She found Eli by the sound he made, a single cry, cut short. He was on the ground near the remains of the corral, a heavy post down across his lower legs, pinning him. He was conscious, terrified, not yet understanding why he couldn't move. He looked up at her with wide white eyes. Miss Mabel, I see it, she said. Don't move. She grabbed the post with both hands. It was maybe 6 inches in diameter, 10 feet long, dense wood. Under normal circumstances, she couldn't move it. She got her hands under it and lifted anyway, and felt something in her lower back scream in protest and kept lifting, putting everything she had into it until the post rose 2 inches off the ground. Slide, she said through her teeth. Slide toward me now. Eli scrambled. He got his legs out from under the post, and she let it drop and grabbed him by the arm and pulled him to his feet in one motion. The herd was 15 seconds away, maybe 10. She looked around fast. The canyon wall was too far. The wagon was the wrong direction. But there, 8 feet to her left, the canyon's edge formed a narrow rock crevice, a split in the sandstone maybe 4 feet wide and 3 feet deep, protected on 3 sides. She shoved Eli toward it. In there. Now, go? He went. She went in after him, pressing her back against the rock, putting herself between the boy and the opening. Eli pressed in behind her, and she felt his hands grip the back of her shirt, and she braced against the rock walls, as solid and broad and immovable as she could make herself. The herd hit. It wasn't like being near them. It was being inside the sound of them, inside the smell of them, inside the hot, displaced air of 3,000 panicked animals moving at speed. The ground shook so hard she could feel it in her back teeth. A horn caught the edge of the rock inches from her right arm, and sparks flew where it struck the stone. A massive shoulder glanced off the overhang above them, and debris rained down. Eli had his face pressed against her back and was not making any sound at all. She held position. She planted her feet and put her hands on both sides of the crevice and held. It lasted maybe 90 seconds. It felt considerably longer. Then they were past. The sound receded. The dust closed in behind them, thick and choking, swallowing everything. She waited 10 seconds more, then turned around. Eli's face was gray under the dust. He was shaking hard. She checked him, running her hands along his legs, his arms, his head. No serious injury. The post had pinned, but not broken anything. He was bruised and terrified and shaking, but intact. "Are you hurt anywhere?" she asked. No, his voice was unsteady. "No, I'm Miss Mabel. Are you? I'm fine. Stay here." She pushed back toward the crevice opening. "Don't move until I tell you." She stepped out into the aftermath. The dust was extraordinary. She could see maybe 20 feet in any direction, and what she saw in those 20 feet was destruction. The camp had been through a meat grinder. Bedrolls torn and scattered. Supply boxes broken open and spread across the ground. 2 of the wagon wheels had been hit and were lying yards away from where the wagon itself had been. She turned toward the chuck wagon. She stood there looking at it for a moment. It was rubble. Not damaged, not tipped over, rubble. The herd had gone directly through it. The wooden frame was broken into irregular pieces. The canvas cover was shredded and flung across a 20-foot area. Drawers and shelves and the Dutch oven and the possum belly contents were scattered in a long debris trail. And there, in the middle of the wreckage, her mother's cast iron skillet. She walked to it. It was crushed. The handle was bent at an angle that made it something other than a skillet. The cooking surface, the one she'd kept perfect for years, was cracked through the center. She picked it up and held it. Behind her, Eli had come out of the crevice and was standing a few feet away, looking at the wreckage. "Miss Mabel," he said, and stopped. She set the skillet down carefully where she'd found it, exactly where it had landed. She became aware of something changing in the air, a pressure shift, different from the stampede, different from the dust the herd had raised. This was directional. She looked north. The wall of it was visible even through the existing dust, black and brown and enormous, 300 feet high, and moving fast across the plain like a solid thing, a haboob. A dry season dust storm of the kind that swallowed towns and turned midday into midnight in under a minute. "Eli," she said, "back in the crevice right now." He looked at the wall coming toward them and didn't argue. He ran. She turned back for the skillet. She didn't know why. She just couldn't leave it. She grabbed it with both hands and ran. The storm hit before she reached the crevice. She made it to the opening and got one arm inside and grabbed the rock with her fingers and held on as the wall of pressure hit her like something thrown. The roar of it swallowed every other sound. The dust was in her eyes, her mouth, her hair, her lungs. She kept her grip on the rock. She pushed into the crevice until she was inside and pulled Eli in after her, and they pressed into the back of it, together with their shirts over their faces, and the world outside became nothing but dark, screaming air. Eli cried. He was 14 years old and exhausted and terrified, and the world was ending outside, and he cried. And she put her arm around his shoulders and held on, and said nothing because there was nothing useful to say. Sometimes you just held on and waited. They held on and waited. The storm lasted 8 hours. In the gray half-light of early dawn, when the wind finally began to slow, and the dust settled enough to see by, they emerged from the crevice into a world that looked like a different planet. Everything was coated in a fine reddish-brown layer. The wreckage of the camp was half buried. The canyon walls were pale with it. Eli wiped his face. He looked at her headscarf, which had torn sometime in the night on a jag of rock at the crevice entrance and been snatched away by the storm. He looked at the dried blood on her temple, where the rock had caught her during the initial scramble. "You're bleeding," he said. "It's old," she said. "It's fine." She assessed the camp in the growing light. The cattle, or most of them, had run themselves out against the canyon walls to the north. She could see the Nighthawk riders already working to gather them. The horses were scattered but present. The hands were emerging from wherever they'd taken cover, coughing and dust-covered, and counting themselves. She didn't see the chuck wagon. Then she remembered there was no chuck wagon. She walked to where it had been and stood looking at the rubble, calculating. The mathematics of the situation were significant. No wagon meant no shelter for the cooking equipment. No shelter meant exposure. No working Dutch oven setup meant no proper baking. She still had the fire-starting materials. She still had some of the provisions, those that had been in sealed tins that had survived the crush. She could work with fire and tin and improvise structures from salvage. It would require rebuilding the workflow from scratch, but it was survivable. She was already planning when she heard him. "Mabel!" The shout came from the northern end of the camp, raw and carrying, the voice of a man who was not accustomed to fear, and was feeling it anyway. She turned toward it. Gar was there. At the edge of the camp, on foot, covered in dust from hat to boot, his horse behind him. He'd clearly come in from the storm at speed. He was looking at the wreckage of the chuck wagon, and he was looking at the blood on the headscarf snagged on the rock at the crevice entrance, and his face was something she'd never seen on him before. He stood there for a moment, then he made a sound that was not exactly a word, something low and wrecked, and got back on his horse and went straight into the remaining dust cloud at a hard gallop without a single look back. Eli stood beside her. "Watching, he went after you," Eli said. She looked at the place where Gar had disappeared into the thinning dust. The sun was coming up behind the canyon walls. The cowboys were calling to each other across the camp. Somewhere to the north, the cattle were lowing as the riders gathered them in. "I'm right here," she said, mostly to herself. "He doesn't know that," Eli said. She stood there, with her bent, cracked skillet in her hands, and watched the dust where Gar had gone, and felt something she had no good words for, and would not have tried to name even if she had them. Eli reached up and took hold of her hand. He didn't say anything else. She held his hand and watched the dust and waited. He rode for 8 hours. Later, Gar would not be able to account for all of it clearly. He remembered the dust and the dark and the way his horse moved through it with its head low and its ears flat. He remembered calling her name and getting nothing back but wind. He remembered the particular quality of fear that comes when you are searching for someone and finding only the places they aren't. He'd done this before, in the war. Moved through bad country looking for something he needed to find before it was too late. He'd been trained for it. Scout work was patient, systematic, nothing wasted. You read the ground, you read the air. You followed what was there instead of imagining what wasn't. He read the ground. The dust had buried most of the obvious signs, but not all of them. The haboob had come from the north, which meant anything on the south and east sides of obstacles might have partial protection. He moved in a grid pattern, slow and low, his lantern extended. The horse hated the dust, and he didn't blame it. At the 4-hour mark, he found blood, a smear on a rock face, mostly dust-covered, but visible in the lantern. Light where the angle was right, not a lot of blood. Enough to tell him direction. He turned east. He found the ravine by almost riding into it. The chuck wagon's debris had come to rest here, driven by the initial stampede, and then pushed further by the storm. Timber and canvas, and the contents of shelves were scattered across a 40-foot span, and underneath a section of the main frame beam, a pair of boots. He was off the horse before it stopped moving. She was conscious. That was the first thing. Her eyes were open, and she looked up at him with the same steady, focused expression she wore when she was managing something difficult and refusing to let it manage her. Her left ankle was dislocated. He could see it in the angle. The beam across her legs was substantial, 6 inches of oak, probably 200 pounds of it. She had one hand braced against the ravine wall and the other clutching a burlap sack pressed against her chest. "You found me," she said. "Yes." He was already moving to the beam. "My ankle's out," she said. "The joint. Not broken, I think. Just displaced. If you can get the timber off, hold on." He got his hands under the beam and lifted. It was heavy and awkward in the confined ravine, and he didn't care. He lifted it clear and set it aside and knelt beside her. She hadn't made a sound. Not one. He ran his hands along both legs, checking. The ankle was clearly dislocated, the joint pushed wrong. Her right leg had a deep bruise building along the shin, but the bone was intact. Beyond that, scrapes, dust, a cut on her temple that had stopped bleeding. She was still holding the sack. "What's in that?" he asked. She looked down at it like she'd half forgotten it was there. "Winter seed grain," she said. "I grabbed it out of the wagon stores before the storm hit. It's for replanting in the fall. I didn't want it to get lost." She paused. It seemed important. He looked at her for a moment, buried under a beam in a ravine in a dust storm, and she'd been thinking about the seed grain. He took his coat off and laid it over her. Then he built a small fire from pieces of the wagon debris, enough to give light and warmth while he worked. He fashioned a splint for her ankle from flat timber and strips of canvas, moving carefully, talking her through each step. "This is going to hurt," he said. "Then do it fast," she said. He reset the joint with a single firm motion. She made one sharp sound and then went absolutely silent, jaw set, eyes fixed on the far wall of the ravine. By the time he had the splint secured, she had her breathing back under control. "Done," he said. "Good," she said. "Thank you." He got the fire going properly and sat back on his heels and looked at her in the firelight. She was a mess. Dust in her hair, blood on her temple, her dress torn at the hem where the timber had caught it. Her hands, resting on the seed grain sack in her lap, were cut across the palms from where she'd braced against the rock. And she sat there in all of it, with her back straight and her eyes clear, like someone who had made a decision about how to occupy their body a long time ago and was sticking to it. He'd seen men in battle with less composure. "We'll wait here until it's light enough to move," he said. "Can you stand?" "With help, yes." "Then we wait." He took his coat from where it had slid off her shoulders and put it back around them properly. He moved around to sit beside her against the ravine wall, close enough that the shared warmth was real and practical. She didn't pull away this time. The fire threw light and shadow across the ravine walls. Outside, the last of the storm was winding down, the wind fading to a low moan and then to nothing. The silence after a haboob was always remarkable. The world held its breath. She looked at the fire for a while. "Eli?" she asked. "I don't know yet. I left as soon as I saw the headscarf." He paused. If he was in that crevice by the canyon wall, he'd have been protected. "He was," she said. "I put him there before the storm hit. I stayed at the entrance." She touched the cut on her temple lightly. "Got this on the rock coming in. You put him in first. He's 14. Gar looked at her profile in the firelight, the soft line of her jaw, the dust on her cheek, The way her collarbone showed above the open collar of her shirt in the warm light. She was not what San Antonio society would have framed as beautiful. He'd spent enough time around those women to know exactly what that framing looked like and exactly how little it corresponded to anything real. What he saw was something different. A person who had absorbed hard things and not been made smaller by them. A person who grabbed seed grain on the way into a storm because she was already thinking about what came after. He had been thinking about Prescott Ranch for a long time, about what it needed. Not in terms of cattle or land or money, though those things were real and pressing, but in terms of what made a place worth fighting for, what made the work mean something past the money. He hadn't found it in San Antonio. He hadn't found it in any of the places he'd looked. He looked at the fire for a while before he spoke. "I didn't take this drive just for the cattle money," he said. She turned to look at him. "The ranch needs it." "That part's true. I've got debt from my father's last years that I've been carrying for 4 years now, and it doesn't get lighter." He paused. But the money wasn't the only reason. She waited. She was good at waiting. She didn't fill silences with nervous noise, which was rarer than people thought. "I've been looking for a woman strong enough to anchor Prescott Ranch beside me," he said. "I've been looking for a while. Came up empty every time." He kept his eyes on the fire. "The women I met wanted the ranch, but not the work. Or they wanted me, but not the life. Or they were exactly what they appeared to be, which was fine for someone else, but not for what I needed." He stopped. "Then you walked into a staging yard with a skillet and offered to cook for $1. The fire cracked and settled. "You're saying you came on this drive to find a wife," she said carefully. "I'm saying I came on this drive to find a partner." He looked at her then. "There's a difference. A wife can be a transaction. A partner is a person you'd trust with everything." She held his gaze. "Me," she said. "Not a question." "Exactly." More like she was testing whether the word fit the context. "You," he said. She looked back at the fire. A long moment passed. "Gar." Her voice was quiet. "I'm a heavy, disgraced, virgin widow. That's the resume I'm walking around with." "I know your resume," he said. "I'm not interested in it." "You should be. The world is. The world has been wrong about you since before you could defend yourself against it." He shifted to face her more directly. "Mabel, look at me." She did. His voice dropped. Not softer, exactly. More concentrated. "I want the only woman strong enough to stand in a dust storm with me." She sat with that. She didn't deflect it, and she didn't accept it quickly. She sat with it the way she sat with everything, giving it honest weight. "Your ranch hands will talk," she said. "Let them. Your neighbors will talk. They'll have something to say regardless. That's what neighbors do." "I'm not what people expect a trail boss's wife to look like." "Good," he said simply. "I'm not interested in what people expect. I'm interested in what's real." Another silence. The fire was burning low and steady. Outside, the sky was beginning to pale at the edges. "I haven't said yes," she said. "I know. I haven't said no either. I know that too." She looked at him. The cut on her temple had a thin, dried track below it. Her hands were still folded over the seed grain sack. The sheepskin coat was enormous on her, and she wore it with complete unself-consciousness, like she'd stopped worrying about the size of things a long time ago. "Ask me again in Abilene," she said, "when the drive is done, when I've had a chance to think on it, without a dislocated ankle and a dust storm in the way." He almost smiled. Fair enough. He got up and fed the fire and went to check on the horse. When he came back, she was still awake, watching the light build on the far wall. He settled back beside her, and they sat together in comfortable quiet until the sky was light enough to move by. He helped her up, took most of her weight on his arm, and walked her out of the ravine. When the ground was uneven, she held onto his coat lapel without being asked, and he adjusted his pace to match hers without being asked. And neither of them commented on it. He got her up on the horse first, then mounted behind her, one arm around her waist to keep her steady. She held the seed grain sack in her lap the whole way back. When they rode into camp, the sun was fully up. The surviving hands were already at work. gathering cattle and salvaging what they could from the wreckage. Eli saw them come in from across the camp and ran. He stopped a few feet short, checking himself, remembering he was 14 and trying to maintain some dignity. Then he gave it up entirely and came the rest of the way at a run and grabbed Mabel's hand. The moment Gar helped her down, Eli stopped, started again. "I'm glad you're okay." "I told you I was fine," she said. "You were missing," he said. "I was located," she said. "Just took a while." Eli looked at her for a moment with an expression that was too old for his face and too young to hide. Then he nodded and helped her toward a salvaged crate to sit on, staying close enough to catch her if the ankle gave way. Barnaby appeared with coffee from somewhere, which told her someone had thought to build a fire and find the salvageable tins. She accepted the cup and drank it and looked around at the camp. There was a great deal of work to do. She started making a list. Getting Mabel back to camp was one thing. Getting the drive moving again was another. The chuck wagon was gone. That was the central, unavoidable fact around which everything else had to organize itself. Gar spent the first morning back assessing what could be salvaged and what couldn't. The answer was that the wagon itself was beyond repair, but the iron hardware was intact, the axles were recoverable, and a surprising amount of the sealed tin provisions had survived. Mabel sat on her salvaged crate, with her ankle splinted and her seed grain sack beside her, and managed the inventory assessment from where she sat. She sent Eli and two of the other hands through the debris field with a systematic checklist she'd constructed from memory, calling out each item category and recording what came back. At the end of 2 hours, she had a full picture. "We can keep moving," she told Gar. "We need a supply wagon from the nearest settlement, which Barnaby says is 12 miles east. Send 2 men today, have them back by morning with a flatbed and basic provisions. I can cook over open fire until we get something proper. It's slower, but it's workable." "What do you need?" she told him. He listened without interrupting and sent the men within the hour. In the meantime, she set up the most functional outdoor kitchen she'd ever had to improvise. 3 rocks and a flat piece of iron from the wagon frame made a serviceable grill. The Dutch oven had survived, dented but usable. She had fire. She had some provisions. She had 2 sound hands to help her. She made breakfast for 15 men over an open fire with no wagon and a dislocated ankle that she was keeping strictly off the ground as much as possible. Every plate was cleaned, as usual. Grover ate without a word and then walked past her on his way back to work and said quietly, "You're something else, Miss Sterling," and kept walking before she could respond. She took it as high praise. By the second day, the supply wagon had arrived, basic and functional, nothing like the Studebaker she'd lost, but adequate. She reorganized her system to fit it and kept moving. Gar had posted a secondary Nighthawk rider on the herd and added a watch rotation on the supplies. He hadn't said specifically why, but she noticed and she understood. She was still watching Rutledge. He had been quiet since the stampede, too quiet in a way that was its own kind of loud. He did his work, rode his rotation, said little. He stayed away from her specifically. She watched him the way you watched weather you didn't trust, not with alarm, but with consistent, peripheral attention. She started noticing new things. The first was the grease on his holster. It wasn't saddle oil, which had a specific color and smell she knew well. It was axle grease, the same compound she used to coat the supply wagon's wheel housings to keep them from drying and cracking in the heat. There was no reason a rider should have axle grease on his holster. The second was the hot pepper residue. She found it by accident on the 3rd day after the stampede. She was inspecting the remaining salt pork for quality, working through the new provisions the supply wagon had brought, and she found a barrel that had been among the original stock, one that had survived the wreck. The pork inside was spoiled, not old spoiled, not heat spoiled, chemically compromised. She pressed a small amount between her fingers and then carefully touched the tip of her tongue to it. Hot pepper, mixed in with the brine. enough to accelerate bacterial growth in the warm weather, destroy the preservation, make the meat unusable. This had been done intentionally, before the stampede, before the storm. She sat with the barrel for a long moment, running through the timeline in her head, the minor water contamination she'd noticed on day 2 and dismissed, the coffee that had tasted off, the salt lost in the canyon, and now this, salt pork deliberately poisoned in the barrel, waiting for her to serve it to 15 men. She put the lid back on the barrel. She found Gar at the head of the column and rode out to him on the camp horse. Barnaby had lent her, sitting sideways to keep her splinted ankle clear. "I have something," she said. He read her face and pulled his horse sideways out of the column without a word. She told him. She walked him through each thing in order, specifically. The water, the coffee, the salt in the canyon, the axle grease on Rutledge's holster, the barrel. She kept her voice level and factual. She didn't speculate past the evidence. She presented what she had and let it speak. Gar listened without interrupting. His expression didn't change much, but something in his jaw went tight about halfway through and didn't loosen. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The grease on the holster," he said. "You're certain it's axle grease? I've been using it every day for 3 weeks. I know what it smells like. And the barrel. You still have it, sealed and set aside. You can check it yourself." He nodded slowly. He was doing what she'd done, running the timeline, building the picture. She could see it in the way his eyes moved, not looking at anything external, looking inward at the accumulated evidence. "He's signaling someone," Gar said. "That's what I think. The night fires. The salt." Making the drive look weak, she paused. "Someone outside knows what's happening in here. They've been waiting for the drive to fail enough to move. Rustlers. That's my guess." He looked at her. "You've been carrying this alone since the canyon. I didn't have enough to bring you yet. I do now." He held her gaze for a long moment. She had the impression he was thinking about, saying something about that, about the weight of carrying it alone, but he made the practical decision instead, which she respected. "We keep it between us," he said. "Don't let Rutledge know he's been seen. I want to know who he's signaling to before we move on him." She nodded. "I'll keep watching." "You've been watching all along. Kitchens see everything," she said. "People forget the cook is there." They rode back to the column separately and said nothing more about it that day. 3 days later, the rustlers showed their hand. They came at dawn, which was when tired men were tired enough and awake enough to make mistakes. A gang of 7 riders appeared on the ridge above the canyon's eastern exit, and they didn't announce themselves as friendly. Gar had the Nighthawk riders already positioned. He'd been positioning them for 2 days, ever since Mabel had brought him the evidence, moving men quietly into place without explaining why, and letting the crew assume it was standard precaution after the stampede. When the rustlers came over the ridge, they expected to find a crippled drive with demoralized hands and a demolished supply situation. What they found was 15 cowboys who had been waiting for them. Gideon Cole led the gang. Gar knew his name from the warrants, posted in 3 counties, a hard man with a business arrangement that had apparently included Lyle Rutledge as his inside source. The fight was short and extremely loud. Mabel did not hide. She had thought about it. Practically, she had a dislocated ankle, no chuck wagon, and no business being in a gunfight. All of those things were true. She also had a double-barrel shotgun from the supply wagon's emergency kit, a full box of shells, and an elevated position on the rock ledge above the camp that gave her a clear sightline across the entire eastern approach. She climbed up there on one good foot and a lot of determination before the first shot was fired. From the ledge, she could see everything. The rustlers coming down off the ridge, Gar's riders fanning out to meet them. The confusing, fast, close-quarter chaos of men on horses in tight canyon country. She could also see Dewey, who'd taken a hit in the first exchange and was down on the ground 40 feet below her, trying to get himself behind a rock. She made 2 decisions simultaneously. The first, She fired both barrels at a rustler who was maneuvering toward Gar's blind side. She didn't hit him. She didn't need to. The proximity of the blast turned his horse and sent him scrambling in the wrong direction, which bought Gar the seconds he needed. She reloaded with hands that were absolutely steady. The second, she shouted down to Grover, who was nearby and upright. "Dewey's down behind the gray rock. East side. He needs cover to move." Grover looked up at her on the ledge, took in the shotgun, took in the fact that she was managing both the weapon and a medical directive. At the same time, and without any hesitation at all, he moved to cover Dewey. The fight lasted 11 minutes, she counted. At the end of it, 4 rustlers were in custody, 3 had fled, and Gideon Cole was on the ground, with his hands tied behind him, and an expression of profound personal offense on his face. Lyle Rutledge was in the middle of the camp with Barnaby's rifle at his back. He had tried to run when the rustlers appeared, which was itself a confession. Barnaby had been watching for exactly that and had positioned himself accordingly. Quiet, steady Barnaby, who had treated Mabel with dignity from the first day, had spent 2 days reading the same situation she had and drawn his own conclusions. He hadn't said anything to anyone. He'd just gotten into position. Mabel climbed down from the ledge, one-footed careful, the shotgun across her back on its strap. Eli P. appeared at the bottom to help her down the last section, and she took his hand. The cowboys were gathered in the camp center, breathing hard, checking each other. Nobody badly hurt. Dewey had a grazed shoulder that looked worse than it was, and 2 other men had minor injuries. Given the odds and the terrain, that was remarkable. Several of the hands looked at Mabel as she came in from the ledge. Grover looked at her for a long moment. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "You were up on that ledge," he said. "I had a clear angle," she said. "You redirected that rider off Gar. Seemed like the right moment to fire." Grover stared at her. Something was moving across his face. A complete and total revision of a position he'd held for weeks, visible and unguarded. "You directed me to cover Dewey," he said. "While you were firing, you were the closest man who was upright." He stared at her a while longer. Then he turned away without another word and went to check on Dewey. She'd take it. She was getting good at translating Grover. Gar crossed the camp to where she stood. He looked at the shotgun on her back, then at her face, then at the splinted ankle. "You climbed that ledge on a dislocated ankle," he said. "It's mostly healed, Mabel." "I had a good angle," she said. "Someone had to use it." He looked at her for a moment with that expression she still didn't have a clean name for, part exasperation, part something else entirely, and said nothing. Rutledge was brought before the group. He stood with Barnaby's rifle behind him, and Gar in front of him, and the whole crew around him, and he looked at none of them. His jaw was set, and his eyes were on the ground. Gar was brief. "You poisoned our provisions," he said. "You triggered the stampede that destroyed the chuck wagon and nearly killed 2 members of this crew. You signaled Cole's gang and gave them information about our position and supply status. And you did it because you want this ranch to go under." He paused. "You're going to Abilene in restraints. The marshal there will hear the evidence." Rutledge looked up then. He looked at Mabel. She held his gaze. "Your kitchen woman," he said. "She's the one who figured it." "She's the one who paid attention," Gar said. "There's a lesson in that, Rutledge. If you spent less time looking down on people and more time watching what they're actually doing, you might have anticipated the problem." Rutledge said nothing more. Barnaby walked him to the supply wagon and secured him. Professionally, without conversation or roughness, just efficiently, the same way he did everything. That evening, Mabel made camp over an open fire, the same way she'd been doing since the stampede. The cowboys gathered around it in the usual loose arrangement, eating their supper, talking low. The tension of the day was still there, but loosening, the way tension does when the worst is past, and the body starts to understand it can relax. Eli sat beside her fire. He ate everything on his plate twice, and then looked into the empty tin with an expression of sincere regret. "Miss Mabel," he said, "Do you think the next cook who works a cattle drive will be as good as you?" She looked at him. "I think the next cook who works a cattle drive will be a person doing their best with what they have," she said. "Same as me, same as everyone." He considered this. "But will they make biscuits as good?" "Probably not," she said. He nodded, satisfied. He set his plate down and helped her clean up, the same way he always did. Gar sat on his usual crate across the fire, his map folded on his knee, not looking at it. He was watching his crew settle down. The familiar end-of-day ritual of men who had been through something hard together and were still there. He glanced across the fire once. She was already looking at him. She looked away first and went back to her work. But she was almost smiling, and the firelight caught it. And he sat there with his unread map and let himself feel something he hadn't let himself feel in a long time. Something close to certain. The last 200 miles to Abilene changed the drive. Not the land, which stayed flat and golden and relentless under the August sun. Not the cattle, which moved with the particular resigned momentum of animals that had been walking long enough to forget they ever did anything else. What changed was the crew. Specifically, the crew's relationship to Mabel Sterling. It happened without announcement. It was the kind of shift that accumulates rather than arrives, built from small moments over days, each one adding its weight until the total was undeniable. They started hauling her water without being asked. 3 men established an unofficial rotation. Dewey filled her barrels every morning before she was done with breakfast. Eli did it on Dewey's off days. A quiet cowboy named Hatch, who had never spoken more than 6 words to her the entire drive, started chopping her firewood in the afternoons without comment or explanation. She noticed all of it. She didn't make a production of it. She said thank you, specifically and sincerely, each time, and went back to work. Gar noticed it, too. He mentioned it to Barnaby one evening while they were riding the herd's perimeter. "They've turned around," Gar said. Barnaby was quiet for a moment. "Men respect what they can see," he said. "They saw her pull that boy out from under a post during a stampede. They saw her on that ledge with a shotgun. They saw her cook breakfast with a dislocated ankle and no wagon." He paused. Hard to keep a prejudice when the facts keep contradicting it. Gar nodded. "She showed them who she was," Barnaby said. "They just needed long enough to look." The drive pushed north. The heat stayed brutal. They crossed 2 more rivers without incident, which Gar attributed to good luck, and Mabel attributed to better preparation, and both of them were right. She had pre-staged the wagon crossing at both points, walked the banks herself on her recovering ankle, and briefed the lead riders on the current direction before they touched water. The ankle was healing well. She'd been careful, which did not come naturally to her, but she'd been careful. The joint had mostly settled back into proper position, and the swelling was down to a reasonable amount. She still favored it. She expected she would for a while. On a Tuesday evening, 11 days out from Abilene, Grover came to her fire. He didn't come with a plate or a cup. He came empty-handed, which was unusual enough that she turned to look at him before he'd said anything. He was carrying something, but not openly. He had it tucked under his arm, with the deliberate nonchalance of a man doing something that makes him nervous and refusing to show it. He set it down on the tailgate of the supply wagon and stepped back. Her cast iron skillet. Except it wasn't the crushed wreck she'd left in the stampede debris. The crack in the cooking surface had been filled and hammered smooth. The handle had been straightened. The overall shape had been reformed. It wasn't perfect. There was a slight irregularity in the surface she could see from where she stood, the memory of damage that good ironwork couldn't fully erase. But it was her skillet, recognizably, functionally, hers. She walked to it and picked it up. The weight was right. The balance was right. She turned it over in her hands. "Found a forge at the last settlement," Grover said, behind her. "Took me 3 hours. Old Smith there knew what he was doing." He paused. I watched him. Made sure he did it right. She turned around. Grover's expression was doing something uncomfortable. He was a man who wore his feelings on his face the way most people wore their least favorite shirt, reluctantly, and only when there was no alternative. He looked at the ground briefly, then back at her. Then he dropped to one knee. It was such an unexpected motion that she took a half step back. Several of the nearby cowboys had gone still. Eli, sitting at the edge of the fire, had gone wide-eyed. Grover was looking up at her with an expression of complete and genuine sincerity. "Miss Sterling," he said, "I was wrong. I was wrong from the first day in that yard and every day after it, and I was wrong in ways I'm not proud of." He paused. "This skillet isn't just a kitchen tool anymore. It's your scepter on this trail." The word hit her oddly. Scepter. It was not a word she would have expected from Grover's mouth. She had the impression he had thought about it specifically, chosen it specifically, for exactly that reason. She stood there, holding the skillet. The crew was watching, not intrusively, just present. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the dark, the cattle moved and settled. She reached down and put her free hand under Grover's elbow and raised him to his feet. He came up with the slight resistance of a man who felt he maybe hadn't served out the full weight of his kneeling, but who accepted the reprieve. "Stand up, Grover," she said gently. He stood. She looked at him steadily. "Respect isn't something handed out because of how a person looks," she said. "It's earned through skill, sweat, and kindness." He held her gaze. He nodded once, slow. "You earned it," he said, "by any measure I've got." She looked down at the skillet. Then she looked back up at the assembled cowboys, the men who had mocked her in a staging yard 6 weeks ago, and who were now standing in a loose circle around a fire, watching Grover kneel on the ground. "All of you," she said, including them all with a look around the circle. "I want you to hear this. Every person on this drive has skills. Every person showed up and did hard work in hard conditions. That's what earns a place in any outfit worth belonging to." She let that sit for a moment. "Not what you look like. Not what people said about you before you arrived. What you do. Nobody said anything." Eli was nodding slowly, not performing agreement, just absorbing it. Barnaby, at the back of the group, stood with his arms at his sides and a quiet expression that she had come to understand. Over 6 weeks meant he was moved. Grover cleared his throat. He picked up the empty coffee cup he'd set down when he came over and held it out toward the pot on the fire with his eyebrows raised. She poured him his coffee. He took it, nodded once more, and went to sit by the fire. The evening resumed. The men ate and talked in the low, tired rhythm of a drive's end approaching. Dewey started a story about his cousin in Missouri that got progressively more improbable and correspondingly better received. Hatch laughed at the ending, which was apparently rare enough that Dewey looked genuinely startled. Gar came to the fire late. He sat on his crate and accepted his coffee and looked at the skillet which Mabel had set on the tailgate of the supply wagon. "Grover did that?" he asked. "3 hours at a forge in the last settlement," she said. He looked at it for a moment. "Good man," he said. "Takes character to do that, more to do it publicly." "It does," she agreed. She poured her own coffee and sat on the wagon steps across from him. The night was cooler than it had been, the first real suggestion of the season turning, a slight edge in the air that hadn't been there a week ago. "How far?" she asked. 11 days, he said. "Maybe 10 if the weather holds." She nodded. 11 days. She ran the inventory in her head, the provisions, the cattle's condition, the horses. Everything was manageable. They were going to make it. She had started letting herself believe that over the past week, not with certainty, but with reasonable confidence, which was about as far as she ever let herself go before the evidence was fully in. Gar was looking at the fire. "You said Askew in Abilene," he said. She'd been waiting for that. Not with dread, just waiting. "I did," she said. 11 days isn't Abilene, he said. "I know. I'm not asking." He paused. "Just wanted you to know I haven't forgotten." "I know you haven't," she said. He looked at her then. She held the look and then looked back at the fire. Her coffee was warm in her hands and the night was cool, and the cattle were settled, and for a moment the world was simply quiet. 11 days, she said. again, mostly to herself. She went to sleep that night with the skillet beside her bedroll like a talisman. Abilene arrived like a promise kept. After 500 miles of dust and river crossings and storms, and everything else the trail had thrown at them, the town appeared on the horizon first as a smudge, then as a shape, then as buildings and a water tower, and the long, low roof lines of the stockyard pens stretching out east of the main street. The cattle smelled the pens before they saw them, and began to move with new energy, pressing forward in a way that made the drag riders earn their pay for the last time. By late afternoon, all 3,000 head were through the gates, and the counting was done, and the buyers were in conversation with Gar at the stockyard office. Record prices, that was the word that came back through the crew by supper time. The best prices anyone had seen in 3 years, driven by a shortage of supply and the particular quality of the Prescott herd. Gar had done what he'd set out to do. The crew got paid in the stockyard office, one at a time, and came out into the street with full pockets and the particular loose-limbed relief of men who had survived something. Dewey went directly to the nearest saloon. Most of the others followed. Barnaby walked quietly to the general store and began a careful and unhurried purchasing process that suggested he had a specific list. Eli walked beside Mabel on the way to the land office, where she was going to record a formal deposit on a parcel east of the Flint Hills that Barnaby had told her about during the last week of driving. Her $100 was in a folded cloth inside her dress pocket. She had earned every cent. She was also wearing a different dress than the one she'd driven 500 miles in. She'd bought it that morning at the dry goods store, a plain cotton print in blue-gray, with clean lines and good buttons. She'd washed her hair. She'd fixed the tear on her sleeve from the haboob and the scuff on her boots as best she could. She looked, she thought, exactly like herself, just cleaner. The land office handled her deposit in 20 minutes. $50 on the parcel to hold it 90 days. $50 remaining. Enough to start. She stood on the land office steps and felt the weight of the coin roll she was putting back in her pocket and thought about what it represented. Not just money, the first thing in her life that belonged entirely to her, bought with her own labor, subject to no one's permission. Her throat was unexpectedly tight. She pressed it back down. "You okay?" Eli asked. He was watching her with a careful expression. "Fine," she said. "Better than fine." She looked at him. "What are you going to do?" After this, he scuffed his boot on the step. "Gar offered me a place at Prescott Ranch," he said. "Wrangler position. Said the remuda needs somebody who actually pays attention to the horses." "He's right," she said, "and you should take it." Eli nodded. He already had. She could tell. He was just making it official by saying it out loud. She left him at the depot steps and walked to the train station. She had thought about this decision for 11 days. She had turned it over from every angle she knew how to use. She had been honest with herself about what she felt, which was considerable, and honest about what she feared, which was also considerable, and she had weighed them against each other, the way she weighed everything. What she kept coming back to was this: Gar Prescott was a good man who deserved a good life. And a good life for a trail boss with a cattle ranch in Texas included, in the eyes of every person who would have an opinion about it, a wife who did not inspire talk, a woman who looked the part, someone the neighbors would not immediately question. She was not that woman. She had spent 6 weeks proving her worth on this trail. She had proven it beyond any argument. But the trail was its own world, with its own rules, and the world outside the trail was different, and she knew it. She had lived in that world. She knew exactly what it did to people who didn't fit its shape. She bought a ticket to San Francisco at the counter. The departure was in 2 hours. She sat on a bench on the platform in her clean blue-gray dress, with her canvas bag at her feet and her skillet wrapped in canvas beside it, and watched the street outside the station. She was going to open a small eatery. She had the money for it now, and the skill for it always. San Francisco had a port and a diverse population, and a culture that was still new enough to be less rigid than what she'd come from. She could build something there. She could build something good. She told herself that several times. She was in the middle of telling it to herself a fourth time when she heard the horse, fast, coming up the main street, not slowing for the foot traffic, which caused a series of shouts and scrambling that she could track through the station window. She watched the street, and she saw him. Gar was riding, like the train was going to leave in 30 seconds, and not 2 hours, which suggested that someone had told him she'd been at the station, but had not looked at the schedule board. His hat was off somewhere. His hair was full of trail dust. He looked exactly like a man who had received bad information and was acting on it without stopping to refine the picture. He tied the horse at the rail in front of the station and came through the door at a pace just short of running. He saw her immediately. She hadn't moved from the bench. He stopped. He stood there, in the station doorway, catching his breath, looking at her. The relief on his face was visible and unguarded, the expression of a man who had not had time to compose himself before he arrived and was not going to bother now. He walked to her. She stood up. He stopped in front of her. He looked at the ticket in her hand, the canvas bag at her feet, the carefully wrapped skillet. He looked at her face. He reached up and unpinned the Trail Boss badge from his shirt. It was a simple thing, a small piece of engraved metal that she had seen on his chest every day for 2 months. He looked at it for a moment, then leaned past her and dropped it on the bench. It made a small, final sound against the wood. He took both her hands in his. "I'm not ordering you to stay, Mabel," he said. His voice was steady, but only just. "I'm begging you, if you get on that train to San Francisco, I'm selling Prescott Ranch to go with you. Because your freedom belongs where I am, and my future only matters if you're in it." The station was not empty. There were half a dozen people on the platform, a family near the far bench, a porter with a cart, 2 men in business clothes reading papers. They were all, with varying degrees of subtlety, paying attention. She looked at him. She had prepared, over 11 days, a reasonable and considered response to this moment. She had constructed arguments. She had anticipated his counter-arguments. She had been, she thought, genuinely rational about it. She looked at his face, and at her hands in his, and at the badge sitting on the bench behind her, and all the prepared arguments sat there in her head, waiting patiently while she made her actual decision. "You'd sell the ranch," she said, without a second thought. "That's not rational." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." She looked at him for a long moment. "You're a terrible negotiator," she said. "I know, leading with your absolute floor position. I'm aware." She let out a breath. "I'm not the woman your neighbors are expecting." "Good. I mean it. They will talk, Mabel. They will." "Let them," he said. "I'll be too busy to listen." She looked down at the ticket in her hand. She turned it over once. Then she looked up. "I'm keeping the land parcel," she said, "in my name. Whatever happens, of course," he said immediately. "And I'm not changing how I cook. I'd consider it a personal tragedy if you did." She stood there for another moment, holding all of it, the ticket, his hands, the decision. Then she set the ticket on the bench beside the badge. Gar looked at it. Then he looked at her. Something in his face that had been held carefully for a very long time came loose all at once, quiet and complete. He raised her hands and pressed them together between both of his and held them there. Nobody cheered. This was not a crowd that cheered, but the woman near the far bench was smiling, and the porter had found a reason to be extraordinarily busy with his cart very close to where they were standing. "Abilene," she said. "Abilene," he said. She picked up her canvas bag and her wrapped skillet. He picked up his badge from the bench and pinned it back on. They walked out of the station together into the late afternoon light. 1 year later, Prescott Ranch smelled like wood smoke and something baking. It always did, these days. The wedding had been in October, 3 weeks after they came home from Abilene, in the yard between the main house and the barn. All 15 cowboys attended. Every single one. They wore their best clothes, which varied considerably in quality and definition, But each man had clearly made his version of an effort. Dewey had acquired a new hat. Grover had shaved, which Barnaby said was the first time since before the drive. Eli stood up front the whole time with the focused solemnity of someone who had been given a responsibility and was taking it seriously. He'd brushed his hair, Barnaby cried. He stood at the back and thought nobody noticed. Mabel noticed. The ceremony was short. The food afterward was not. She had spent 3 days preparing it, and it was the best meal she had ever made, because it was the first one she'd made in her own kitchen. She had spent an entire morning of that first week at Prescott Ranch just standing in the kitchen doorway, looking at it, feeling the dimensions of it, thinking about what could go where. The kitchen was big, bigger than she'd expected. Gar had done some work on it before the drive. One of those things she'd only learned about afterward, as she'd learned many things about him gradually and in pieces. He'd had a second oven built in. He'd added shelving along the south wall. He'd left the decisions about everything else to her. She had made decisions. The shelves held preserves she'd put up through November, labeled in her mother's system, the one she'd been taught before she could write very well, and had never stopped using. The work table in the center was scarred from her first 6 months of serious use. The south window let in afternoon light at exactly the right angle for checking bread color, and on the wall beside the door, hung on a custom iron hook that Grover had made and sent by courier with a note that said only, for the scepter, the cast iron skillet, bent handle and all. The crack in the surface that hadn't fully disappeared in the forge, the slight irregularity in the base, the particular darkness of the iron from 30 years of seasoning. It hung there as the first thing she saw when she came into the kitchen and the last thing she saw when she left, not as a decoration, as a record of where she'd come from, what she'd carried, and how far she'd brought it. On the morning of the first anniversary of the day the drive reached Abilene, she was at the stove before sunrise, not because anyone was requiring it, not because 15 men needed feeding before dawn, because this was when she felt most herself, in the quiet hour before the house woke up, with just the fire and the coffee and whatever she was making taking shape in her hands. She was making biscuits. She heard him before she saw him. The particular cadence of his boots on the back hallway, unhurried, familiar. Gar appeared in the kitchen doorway in his work clothes, hat not yet on, hair still from the pillow. He looked at the stove, then at the biscuits taking shape on the board, then at her. "You're up early," he said. "I'm always up early. Earlier than early, then." She worked the dough and didn't look up, couldn't sleep. He came to the stove and poured himself coffee from the pot she'd put on first, the way she always did, and stood there with his cup and looked at her working for a moment. Then he crossed the kitchen and stood behind her and put his arms around her from behind, his large hands resting gently, carefully, over the rounded curve of her belly. She stilled. He pressed his chin lightly against her hair. Neither of them said anything for a moment. The fire crackled. The biscuit dough was warm and ready, under her flour-dusted hands. Outside the kitchen window, the sky was beginning to lighten at the eastern edge, that particular pale gray that came just before color. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Good," she said. "Better than yesterday." She resumed working the dough. "The biscuits are going to be good today. I can tell by the dough." "The dough tells you things?" "After enough years, it does." He was quiet for a moment. His hands stayed where they were, gentle and present. "Eli's coming for supper tonight," she said. "He sent word yesterday." "I know, Barnaby's coming too," said he had something for the baby. "Barnaby doesn't need to bring anything. Try telling Barnaby that." She smiled at the dough. She got the biscuits cut and into the Dutch oven and set up over the coals, then turned around inside the circle of his arms and looked at him. He looked back at her. He had the same face he'd had in the staging yard in San Antonio, the one that looked like it had been outdoors too long and thought too hard and wasn't interested in wasting words. She had learned that face in considerable detail over the past year. She knew where the lines had come from. She knew the scar on his collarbone and the history of it. She knew that he made his best decisions in the early morning and his worst ones when he was hungry, which was information she used practically. She knew his hands, which she had thought about in a cave in a dust storm with a dislocated ankle, more than was entirely sensible. He raised one of those hands now and tucked a strand of hair back from her face with a gentleness that still caught her off guard sometimes, coming from a man who had so much strength in reserve. 1 year, he said. 1 year, she agreed. Outside, the ranch was waking up. She could hear the horses in the barn moving in their stalls. Somewhere across the yard, a door opened and Boots hit the porch. One of the hands starting his morning rotation. The cattle would need checking. The fences on the north pasture needed another look. There was always work. She looked past his shoulder at the skillet on the wall. She had come into this kitchen for the first time, carrying almost nothing. A canvas bag, a skillet that had been crushed and rebuilt, a land deed in her own name. The particular resilience of a person who has been underestimated so many times that it stopped meaning anything. The West had not been kind to her, not at the start and not reliably along the way. It had been hard and hot and brutal and occasionally life-threatening. And it had taken things from her that couldn't be replaced. But it had also given her a fire to cook at, and a crew that had turned around, and a 14-year-old boy who chased her down in a stampede with his hands, and a quiet man who had dropped his trail boss badge on a station bench without a moment's hesitation. And this kitchen, her kitchen, and the person she had always been, just finally with room enough to be it. The biscuits were beginning to smell the way biscuits smelled when they were almost done. She turned back to the stove and checked them, lifting the lid just enough to see the color. Golden. Perfect. Gar sat down at the kitchen table with his coffee and watched her work and said nothing, because nothing needed saying. She pulled the biscuits off the fire. Outside the window, the sky had gone from gray to pale rose, and the first clear light of morning was moving across the Texas plain toward the house. The fire in the hearth of Prescott Ranch burned steady and warm. There's something this story keeps coming back to, and it isn't romance. The romance is real, and it's earned, but underneath it is something older and more essential than that. It's the question of how we measure a person. Mabel Sterling walked into that staging yard, carrying everything she owned, and was laughed at before she opened her mouth. Not because of anything she'd done, not because of any failure or fault, because of how she looked, because of a rumor, because small people needed somewhere to put their contempt, and she was standing there. That's all it was, and the world called it judgment. We do this, people do this. We look at someone for 3 seconds, and we decide we already know the whole story. We decide what they're capable of, what they deserve, what space they're allowed to occupy. And we're wrong far more often than we're willing to admit. What the trail taught those cowboys, what it teaches us, is that the only honest measure of a person is what they do when things get hard. Mabel rose before dawn every single day. She fed people who mocked her. She lifted a post off a boy's legs in the middle of a stampede. She stood in a dust storm with her hands braced against the rock walls and didn't move. She climbed a ledge on a bad ankle and fired a shotgun to protect men who had spent weeks dismissing her. She carried evidence of a traitor in her head for days, alone, quietly, until she had enough to bring it forward the right way. None of that had anything to do with the size of her dress or the rumors attached to her name. All of it had everything to do with her character. Grover understood that by the end. It cost him something to kneel in front of the whole camp and say he was wrong. That's the thing about real respect. Giving it cost you something when you withheld it for the wrong reasons. It requires you to look at yourself. Clearly, Grover did that. And in doing it, he became someone larger than he'd been before. Gar understood it from the beginning, which is what made him worth following. He didn't look at Mabel and see a problem to manage or a liability to account for. He looked at her and saw someone doing the work, and he trusted what he saw. That kind of trust, given based on evidence rather than appearance, is rarer than it should be. And it's the foundation everything else between them was built on. What Mabel herself understood, by the end, is perhaps the hardest lesson of all. She had spent so long absorbing the world's verdict about her that she had started to enforce it herself. She bought that train ticket to San Francisco, not because she wanted to leave, but because she had decided, quietly and without being asked, that she didn't deserve to stay. That was the last wall, the one she'd built herself out of all the years of being told she wasn't enough. Gar throwing that badge on the bench didn't just stop her from leaving. It named the wall and refused to let it stand. Your freedom belongs where I am, and my future only matters if you're in it. That's not a line from a man trying to win an argument. That's a man telling a woman that the story she's been telling herself about her own worth is wrong, and that he will put down everything he's built to prove it. We all carry versions of that story. The one we inherited from the people who failed to see us clearly. The one that says we're too much of something, or not enough of something else, or that we should wait quietly and take up less space and be grateful for whatever comes our way. This story says, put down the ticket. Not because someone else needs you to, because you've earned the right to look the world square in the eye. Because the work you've done is real. Because you are not the verdict other people handed down about you before they ever bothered to look. The West in 1878 was brutal and unforgiving, and it did not care about fairness. But it had one honest quality. It showed you exactly who people were when the pressure was on. Strip away the city manners and the social rankings and the opinions, and what you had left was either someone who showed up or someone who didn't. Mabel showed up every single morning at 3:30 in the rain and the heat and the fever and the aftermath of a stampede. She showed up with skill and care and a cast-iron skillet that survived being crushed under a cattle, heard because the iron was that good and she had kept it that well. That skillet hanging on the wall of Prescott Ranch kitchen is not a decoration. It's a record of every hard mile, every mocked morning, every moment she chose to stay standing when the easier thing would have been to fold. It is bent and scarred and not quite perfect, and it is exactly where it belongs. So is she, and so, perhaps, are you. This story is a work of fiction set in the American West of 1878. All characters, events, locations, and dialogue are entirely the product of the author's imagination and are used for storytelling and entertainment purposes only. Any resemblance to real persons, living or deceased, or actual historical events is purely coincidental. The depiction of historical settings, social conditions, and period attitudes in this story reflects the era in which the narrative is set and does not represent the views or values of the author or this channel. This story is intended for mature audiences and contains themes of grief, loss, social prejudice, and peril. Viewer discretion is advised.